We'd like to thank ZRG, the registry, our sponsor for this episode. Learn how higher education institutions navigate change with proven interim leadership at zrgpartners.com/chronicle. This is College Matters from the Chronicle.
I wish that most faculty were iconoclastic or creative in their thinking that way. I think that's been beaten out of us, too, in the same way that it's been beaten out of the students.
At a moment of rapid technological change, heightened political uncertainty, and urgent environmental foreboding, professors and pundits are spending a lot of time talking about young people. The discourse around Gen Z students, who are now in their early teens and late 20s, is relentless and often grim. The conventional rap on young people, particularly those in college, is that they're hyper-transactional, super anxious, and generally apathetic about schoolwork. My guest today, Ian Bogost, has thought a lot about these issues as a professor of computer science and engineering at Washington University in St. Louis, where he is also a professor and director of film and media studies. As a contributing writer for The Atlantic, Bogost often wrestles with what this generation reveals to us about the state of the world, and, refreshingly, how much Gen Xers like him and me are probably to blame for it. Ian Bogost, welcome to College Matters.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I contacted you, I think, late last year because I love your writing.
Thank you.
And you have been exploring a theme that is of interest to me, which I think is a question about whether a lot of the hand-wringing and belly aching around Gen Z students has something to do with Gen X, folks like you and myself, who have sort of set the conditions in which these students arrive to college. Talk to me about that as something that you're curious about.
As a writer, as a journalist, and as a professor, I'm a faculty member at Washington University in St. Louis as well. I guess that my approach to higher ed today is just to try to be empathetic and try to look at the situation from all sides. So that's sort of where I start. And when I look at it from all sides, I see, like there's plenty of blame to spread around. It doesn't fall just on Washington. It doesn't fall just on administrators. It doesn't fall just on faculty. It doesn't fall just on students or parents or whatever character you want to cast in this play. It's pretty evenly distributed, or maybe if it's not evenly distributed, at least that everyone's in a slightly different circumstance. So I think, as everyone's looking for like the answer, what's wrong, maybe not even to fix it, but just to point at it and go, there it is. That's the thing that's wrong. I'm more interested in just trying to identify the dynamics that are at work. And to your point, a lot of those have to do with people like me and not people like the students who sometimes take the fall or the blame.
What do you think is the conventional rap on 18 to 22-year-olds, and how does that differ from what you see?
I think the conventional idea is that the students are coddled or lazy or dumber than they used to be, or not held to high enough standards, or distracted, or obsessed with their phones, or mentally ill, or whatever, diagnostic you want to apply. And if only they would buck up, or we would hold them to higher standards, then everything would be remedied. Isn't that sort of the conventional wisdom?
I think so. Certainly in connection with ChatGPT and AI, the perception is that this is a generation that doesn't take college particularly seriously, is willing to cut corners, doesn't see learning for the sake of learning as a particularly worthy endeavor. I think those are sort of the stereotypes.
Yeah. And, I think if you look at, I have two kids who are Gen Z age. And so I try to talk to them about what they see. And then I have all my students. And I think if you look at their situation, the promise that we thought we were given isn't panning out. And so the stakes having changed, our investment in the process has necessarily also changed. And I certainly see this in the classroom and all the folks I talk to at the various colleges and universities that I visit when I'm doing reporting. There's, kind of a sense of, what is this? Is this the same promise that you were given?
What do you mean by the promise isn't panning out?
You were supposed to work hard in high school, do a bunch of stuff that made you a full and round and deep person, and then you get into a good school and you could kind of do whatever you wanted in terms of like a major, a course of study, because the economy and the world was supposed to deliver opportunity to you. Mm-hmm. And that allowed college, in this mythical sense, to be a very uniquely American thing, a kind of fused credentialing and coming of age process That's the promise that we've had since before the mid-century when everyone started going to college, certainly before that for the elite kind of aristocracy of American society. And you'd go through that process and you come out the other side. Maybe you'd meet your spouse, maybe you'd get a good job or at least a good foothold, and then you could move on and begin your adult life. And I don't think the students perceive that promise to have panned out, whereas I think a lot of the faculty, they don't know that it hasn't, so they don't see it that way.
I feel like if that promise held, that it would be a little more acceptable for a professor to be a little looser in the classroom about expectations. You wrote a piece not long ago that I think was tied to the report that came out of Harvard about grade inflation at Harvard.
Report, right.
And one of the things that really struck me was you were talking about your personal journey, I think dating back to when you were at Georgia Tech. Mm-hmm. As someone who gave sometimes open-ended assignments that were meant to elucidate creativity, insight, show me what you think I'm asking for, surprise me.
Yeah.
Your students hated this?
They hated it. And that was a long time ago. We're talking about almost 20 years ago, and they hated it then.
Different generation altogether.
Well, yeah. But they came to appreciate it later. They were already starting to hate it, though. Maybe it was 15 years ago. Certainly it was by 15 years ago I was doing that work. Those are like mid-late millennials, aren't they? Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's just a Gen Z thing. Like everything, it's been building. But yeah, I would sort of say, look, like you're in college. Like the idea is I want to give you space to grow and explore. I'm not going to tell you exactly what I want. Everyone kind of wants someone in authority to tell them exactly what to do. And this is actually true for faculty as much as it is for students. So you think about, the faculty, I'm going to paint with broad brush here, okay? So forgive me. I got a PhD. This is what faculty think. I got a PhD. I got into a PhD program, so I deserve to finish, so I deserve to get a tenure track job, so I deserve to get tenure. Those sorts of expectations have risen at the same time as tenure track jobs have become scarcer, of course, but at the same time as the students have been kind of floating that same bet, that I showed up, I got into Georgia Tech, I got into Harvard, I got into wherever I got into. I'm already smart. I don't have to deliver anything more than I already did. I think that's a widespread idea in the university.
I wonder, too, whether this idea that we want students to embrace ambiguity in college, is that really true, though? Because a lot of professors don't like giving participation points. This sort of, it seems like a participation trophy. It's also highly subjective. We have this hyper-selective admissions process at highly selective colleges that's all about box checking, no matter how much an admissions officer or counselor may say that we want it to reflect, your unique journey. Students are taking that to mean I need to go out and check a lot of boxes. You've written about this education software called courseware that allows students to track their grades down to the millisecond of what they have in a given class. There are a lot of structural reasons that seem to be sending signals to young college students that we actually don't want you to be chill at all. And so I can understand why they see some contradiction here.
Yeah, no, they've received the message we've sent, which is that there's something I have in mind, And not only is there something I have in mind, whether me as a professor, an admissions officer, all the characters you named, you're supposed to guess. I'm not going to reveal what it is to you, but it's actually super urgent. If you don't get it right, then your whole life is ruined. That's sort of the sensibility. And that ambiguity, that loss of ambiguity, everything feels more precarious, and so there's this stronger desire. Everything is more precarious, so there's a stronger desire for answers on all parts, on all sides. I want to know if my grant's going to come through or not. I want to know if my tenure is going to come through. I want to know if this course is going to make. I want to know if I'm going to have the opportunity to do the next thing, whether that's a faculty member, a staff member who's like, well, what's the career advancement path at this place? All of this is sort of happening all at once. I do think philosophically, I was intellectually reared in the high theory 1990s in the humanities, and I was thinking about this just last week because a philosopher friend of mine did this YouTube lecture on the philosopher Jacques Derrida. You remember the Derridian days of high theory, and it was all about ambiguity and uncertainty and undecidability, and that was the water we swam in. That was everything. It was all this sort of sense of, well, what if you don't really know, though? But also we lived in a different era. We didn't have an internet life like we do today. Nowadays, if you have a question, you can get the answer, or you can get what appears to be the answer by Googling it or plugging it into ChatGPT or Claude. And so the information space is also, it implies that the answers are discoverable. And then we have this whole elite, technology and to some extent policy apparatus saying, oh, yeah, we know what the answer is. There's really no uncertainty.
Have you read or heard about the Ian McEwan novel that came out last year, What We Can Know?
I've heard about it. Have not yet read it.
Well, it reminds me of what you just said about we can get the answer. And I won't spoil the novel. It's great. But the premise is that future historians, after sort of a climate change apocalypse, are able to go back through all of our emails and text and notes and put together sort of a loose history of humanity and specific people. But of course, the crux is that we lie in our emails, we lie in our text, we lie to ourselves. And I wonder if you think that technology is creating a bit of a false perception that the answer is out there, and that's affecting students and faculty.
It certainly is. It certainly is. You mentioned courseware, and it's such a simple example, but I love how elucidating.
Tell people what that is, because not everybody will know.
So all I mean by courseware is it's a generic name for the software service that we use now to run our classes. So it used to be, when I started teaching, certainly when I was in school, you go to class, you get a syllabus on paper, you get some books or some readings or some lab work or whatever it was you were doing. You'd come to class, and that would be that. You'd turn in your papers or your work usually on paper, right? And then courseware came along, starting about early 2000s, and tried to automate all of that into software in the same way that everything got automated into software. It's supposed to make it easier to manage, and now you can, get your papers turned in that way and return them and keep track of your grade book online, and the students could see how they were doing. And what happened is that, like all software does, courseware sort of ossified people's brains around what was possible in the classroom. And the students started, just in the same way that they would learn to the test or learn to the circumstances, operating in tandem with what courseware encouraged. And one of the biggest things it encouraged was,
this is what I know the machine wants, and I will do it.
Yeah, this is what I know the machine wants, The most important change was that they could always see their grades all the time. Not their grade on a paper, but their overall grade, because it was calculating it. It's when I was in school, I kind of knew how I'd done, but unless I sat down and calculated everything, I didn't know what my final grade might be. It was at that time kind of unthinkable to go into your professor's office and say, can you calculate my final grade right now? I want to know how I'm doing. And how I stand. If you were truly worried, or if you got called in because I thought the student was doing badly, maybe that was just a social faux pas. But then suddenly with courseware, it was happening all the time, constantly and automatically. I remember once, many years ago, I had a student come up to me after class, and I used courseware, but there was some ambiguity, to your point, in the way that I was using it. And the student said, yours is the only class where I don't know how I'm doing. And I was like, what do you mean? I've given you all your assignments back. There's plenty of work. It's not like we have one paper. What is it that you mean? And what he meant was, I don't have this dashboard view of my performance to judge and adjust to.
Right.
And, that's a structural change that encourages a different kind of behavior than the one that I had as a student, which was hey, let's just kind of loosely move through the flow of the river that is this course, see what happens, and allow myself to immerse in its waters. And I think that's just much harder now for an extremely dumb reason. And the dumb reason is just, we use software to run our courses now.
Well, something you sometimes hear employers say about students coming out of college today is, wow, these young people just need enormous amounts of feedback and enormous amounts of direction. And I wonder if you think that that's in any way a product of the educational experience they've had.
It must be. It is harder. It feels harder to tell a student, here's a start. Go ahead. Go figure it out. I know you can do it. And, it does work if you do it, but it's harder to invest that trust. And the students are more anxious, and they come to you, and they're people, and you want them to be happy and content. And, in many cases, faculty also want or need their approval on course evaluations, or they perceive that they do. Broadly speaking, the students want to succeed and the faculty want to help them. Otherwise, nobody would be in this. But it is much harder to use that kind of encouragement. But then, on the employer's side too, Like, it's really, really, really brutally hard to get even an entry-level job these days. They make kids go through like 10 rounds of interviews. It takes months sometimes. And then when they get on the job, they don't really train or teach them what to do either. When I said earlier that there's plenty of blame to go around, I really meant it. There's plenty of blame to go around. And you could say, well, you're poorly preparing the students for work. We could say, well, you're poorly preparing the work for the students.
Stick around. We'll be back in a minute. If there's one thing higher education rarely gets, it's a convenient moment for leadership change. A president leaves, a provost steps away, a cabinet role opens up, and the institution has to keep moving. ZRG, the registry, helps colleges and universities bridge these moments with proven interim leaders who know how to step in, steady the institution, and keep priorities moving. As part of ZRG, that support goes even further. See how institutions are navigating change with more continuity and less disruption at zrgpartners.com/chronicle. If you're trying to keep up with new academic books, you already know the problem. There's more coming out than anyone can possibly read. That's why New Books Network is the best resource for scholars and deep readers to keep up with new research and writing in their field. New Books Network is a massive collection of long-form interviews with scholars and authors, almost 30,000 conversations on the site across history, politics, literature, science, you name it. You'll hear directly from the authors who lay out their arguments and research methods. New Books Network also works closely with academic publishers, including partnerships with Princeton University Press, Oxford University Press, and MIT Press. So it's a great way to stay current with the kinds of books that shape actual conversations in higher ed. If you want a smart, efficient way to discover books worth taking seriously, go to newbooksnetwork.com. That's newbooksnetwork.com.
I'm Shankar Vedantam, here to tell you about a great mystery. That mystery is you. As the host of a podcast called Hidden Brain, I explore big questions about what it means to be human. Questions like, where do our emotions come from? Why do so many of us feel overwhelmed by modern life? How can we better understand the people around us? Discover your hidden brain. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
You're at WashU. It's a highly selective institution. The students that you're dealing with have incredibly high SAT scores, I would imagine, et cetera. I think the admissions rate, my quick Google, is like 10 to 12%.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So I don't know if you're the best person to ask this, but I am curious whether you think that you are churning out students today who are as ready to be independent, to be productive members of the workforce as you did earlier in your career.
One of the things that makes it hard to answer, and I think about this kind of question all the time in my work, both as a professor and a writer, is that I've been here the whole time, and the change has been slow. And so when I search my brain for what a 2006 student was like compared to a 2026 student, I'm not even sure that I trust my own memory. Mm-hmm. And so it feels, my brain and body wants to say, Jack, yes, you're right. They are different now. They've changed in some way, and I used to be able to do this, and now I can't. But then when I think about it, I think this has been going on for a very long time. We've been in the circumstance we are now talking about much more openly, really, maybe even just since the second Trump administration for all sorts of reasons. We've been in it for much longer than we thought, and certainly the volume has been turned up on it. But I remember having students in 2006 who were a mess, and they'd come into my office. Many faculty have had this experience of essentially being a therapist, for which we're not trained and incompetent, basically. Many women faculty are called on to perform that duty more than men. But, I had students who would come to me and they would, that was essentially what they were looking for. I would never have gone into a professor's office under those circumstances. It was just, it never would have occurred to me.
And I don't know that that's a bad change, right, Ian?
Right. That's the thing. If you say, well, what? You don't care about the students? You don't want to help support them in their emotional health and their full, they're as a full person. You just want to teach them calculus or whatever. No, of course not. I think we were a little bit too disconnected in the past. But also, learning a relationship of disconnection between a student and professor was also useful. Maybe part of the problem is that we never really had great theories of ourselves. It's not a terribly introspective profession, which is bananas to think, because it's all these smart people with PhDs
doing a lot of navel gazing.
Yeah, right. Like, shouldn't we stop and go, gosh, my whole life is a life of the mind. What about my own mind and my own context? And, I talk to a lot of senior administrators at all sorts of different institutions, and on or off the record, when they're telling me about their interactions with faculty as senior executives, right, trying to run these places, they're like, wow, the faculty are really super disconnected from the real world, and they think they have all the answers, and it's very difficult to engage with them. And I do think that's true, and that's the case, and that's been the case for a long time. So,
why do you think that's true, Ian?
That the faculty are disconnected?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that happens when you get an advanced degree, a PhD or what have you, and then you enter a career in which your whole job is to focus on this like little narrowband problem in a subfield of your discipline, that you're just auguring down into the earth forever and you never come back up for air.
Oh, I see.
And you know that you're smart. And
the tunnel vision.
Yeah, you get this tunnel vision. And then you're like, because you know that you know a lot about something, you start to believe, well, wait a minute, maybe I know a lot about everything, actually. And if you've ever been in one of these meetings of faculty where you'll have like a physicist walk into a town hall and say, well, I actually think that the university's attorneys got this First Amendment issue wrong. And you're like, well, that's delightful. I'm not really telling you how to do physics. Why are you telling the lawyers how to do law? And the answer is they mean well. I'm volunteering this. You didn't try to drag it out of me. But university faculty are very, very, very difficult types of people. They're unmanageable. They want life employment under tenure, but they don't want to think of themselves as employees or committed to the institution. It's a very difficult problem. And we are very unlike any other kind of worker in the entire labor market.
But do you think that being iconoclastic or at minimum being just insatiably curious are features that we need in faculty? Do they need that level of independence?
I wish that most faculty were iconoclastic or creative in their thinking that way. I think that's been beaten out of us too, in the same way that it's been beaten out of the students. Climbing the ladder of academic research professional accomplishment now is also immensely hard. And it's measured in the same way that we measure the students, and that we attach numbers like H indices to performance and grant making. And, getting a job or getting tenure nowadays is much harder than it used to be. And, I talk to faculty in many disciplines, and they're exhausted, but they're also, like broadly speaking, I think they're turning a crank these days.
If you were in your 20s now, would you want to go into the academy?
I mean, when I was in my 20s, I didn't think I wanted to go into the academy in the first place. I worked in the technology and entertainment industries, and it was such a brutal life that the university was much more appealing as a lifestyle choice. So I already was suspicious of this job when I didn't have it. But I also know, having done a lot of other jobs and worked in a lot of other professions, finance, advertising, all sorts of things, I know how good we have it. And that's another thing I think that we have not identified and said out loud. You got a lot of faculty in all sorts of disciplines, not just in the humanities, where it's especially true, who have never had any other work or life experience at all. And they've never interacted with different kinds of people or different kinds of workplaces or social contexts. And then we're like, well, please socialize, educate, and contextualize the American youth into their young adulthood. It's kind of a strange ask.
Going back to this question of what kind of graduates colleges are producing, I have been thinking about, what research is out there about these students, et cetera. And Pew has done things for years, but I did come across a piece that the Wall Street Journal ran from a NYU researcher, Susie Welch. She's a professor of management practice at NYU. I can't remember the headline, but it was something like, are these students unemployable? And she cited some study about what employers wanted versus the values that Gen Z students had. And she said there's this huge gap, that employers want employees that value achievement, that value success, and that Gen Z values more than anything self-care and personal pleasure. was the takeaway from her research. And I wonder whether you've seen that disconnect. As written, it sounds like a real knock on young students who are selfish and mostly concerned about self-care and that sort of thing. But I think we can explore a little more deeply why that might be if it's true.
Yeah, I have not read this study, but I suspect in cases like this that there's like a concept mismatch or something like that, you know? I don't even know what self-care means anymore. I wrote about this a little bit in a book I have coming out this year, but like, what did the students think they were saying when they expressed that? And I don't think it's like, I want to go to the spa or I want to eat a little treat or what have you, even though they might delight in those kinds of things. I think what they mean, what I see is, I want to know that there is a future. I want to have a place in the world. I want it not to be a struggle constantly. And that was just not really a question for me as an undergrad. It was fine. I mean, the world was challenging in its way. And that was not an anxiety that my peers and I had. And so I think that mismatch between my interpretation of what you've described, this mismatch between what employers and students want, is that the employers want it all in the student's view. And the students are saying, yeah, okay, well, if you want me to achieve, will you give me an opportunity? Like, can I get an entry-level job without already having one? Or, doing 8 rounds of interviews or like calling in all the nepotism that I can muster so I can get placed by, my uncle or my friend's cousin who happens to be the only way in.
I think it speaks to what you were talking about early in this conversation about the broken promise of college education. Hey, you told me I could come here and I would have a certain kind of life.
Yeah, that's right.
And now I'm not so sure about that. And so maybe Gen Xers didn't have to go around and announce, hey, I'm creating boundaries here because remember, yada, yada, American dream. And maybe now we have a generation of students who feel like they have to announce that. I don't know. Are you watching... I keep asking you about your media diet, Ian, which sounds like it's healthier than mine. But are you watching The Pit?
Yes.
The
yes.
HBO show?
Yeah.
So there was an interesting moment on it recently. I don't know if you've seen this episode, but there's a character.
I can talk fully
so there's
about
a character, Joy, who you may know, who's a med student. And there's a moment in a recent episode where her shift is up.
Yeah.
And she's leaving, and one of the more senior people in the hospital says, we don't just leave when the clock says we leave. You have things to take care of, paperwork. And her point is, like, there's high burnout in this industry. I'm not going to be part of those statistics, and I'm gone. And this actually generated a lot of like online discourse, both pro and con in terms of Joy. Yeah, I've read some Substacks on this, but I thought it was interesting that had entered our popular culture.
And it's funny. Like I remember this episode, and it was a notable scene and all that, and I knew what it was trying to do narratively. And they're good at. It's a soap opera, right? Like, I mean, it's a great show, but it's also a soap opera. But then I think about like my generation. Our generation it's like the original like don't show up slacker generation, right?
Right.
It wasn't about self-care though. That's not how we would have presented it. That wasn't the way. It was like, I don't care, whatever, it doesn't matter.
Dissing the man more than I'm taking care of myself.
Yeah, like the sense of like, I'll show up, I won't, it'll be fine. And that was compatible with responsibility though. It was not incompatible with it. I think a lot of this was that our lives were less overseen, metered, surveilled at the time too. You go to work now and everyone knows if you're at work, not just because you're in desk, because you show up on Slack or whatever. And if you're not present, performing, then there are traces of that lack of presence. I've heard from organizations that are asking for performance in online groupware. Like it's not enough to do my job. I have to be like socially present on Slack or Microsoft Teams.
Mm-hmm.
So like those expectations have risen for everyone. And then, of course, we have telephones in our pockets now, smartphones in our pockets, and so you can work all the time. That wasn't the case in the 1990s or even the early 2000s before the iPhone became popular. So, the conventions for all work have certainly changed. But I think the values haven't really, have they really changed? Mm-hmm. I just don't know if it's really all that different.
Maybe it's the terminology. If you go back to that pit scene, maybe it's just the way that it is wrapped in a certain 21st century ethos. Like, I'm not just saying, hey, I've had enough today. I'm tired. I've got a big shift tomorrow too.
Yeah.
That might be the way you and I had said it. We might not have said, do you know that there are 65% of people in this profession burn out. Now, I realize this is TV writing, Ian.
Well, that was what I was going to say. But the
Yeah.
TV writers, they want us to have this dispute about this character. They want to pathologize the idea of going home and create the online discourse around. They know exactly what they're doing, and that succeeds. We didn't have any of that online discourse either, right? So, like, if someone left work early, which would happen, and you kind of needed them to stick around, then you didn't really have any recourse. Maybe the next day you could be like, hey, like, you kind of left us in a lurch yesterday. Will you, like, let me know before you go so we could talk about it? And they'd be like, yeah, I really just had to get out of here. I knew that I was going to do something I would regret if I didn't. You'd be like, all right. You know, we just kind of talked about these things, which isn't to say it was perfect. And now we, you know, have all this communication technology, and somehow we're communicating with it less.
But we do hear this about college students, the formalization of everything, the dispute with the roommate that now has to be sort of taken to the administration to be worked out.
Well, that has changed. And I think the thing that changed the most there is the pursuit of authority on the student's part. The desire to have authority, to seek it out, to appeal to it, to encourage or demand that authority make decisions or enact policies on behalf of the students. And that could be everything from, my roommate makes me feel unsafe, to, I expect you to make a statement about Israel. And that was not the case. You know, like, I didn't know who the heck a provost was as an undergrad, let alone would I ever imagine engaging with them.
Right.
And that's changed.
Yeah, the appealing to authority thing shows up in some of Pew's research around this too. This was something I really zeroed in on. I looked at it this morning because I knew we were going to talk about this. Pew is sort of getting out of the whole naming generations game because they think it's sort of silly, but they gave us one last nugget. And I was fascinated to see that every generation since the silent generation of the 30s and 40s has wanted an ever more activist government, has said, I want government to be more involved in solving our problems.
Yeah.
So that's not specific to this generation, but I think it is an interesting parallel, what you say about appealing to authority and the idea that people might want a president or a government who's just more up in everybody's business than they used to be.
Right. I mean, you know, maybe they want a nation that functions. We have had a declining social contract for decades now, since long before I was a young person. So it doesn't surprise me to hear that there's a kind of desire for more, like, just a more operational society. But that's a bit different than these appeals to authority too. You know, if it were like, hey,
and an appeal to authority is not an appeal to authoritarianism. I want to make that clear.
No, right. It's like, something is wrong, you need to fix it. And something may not be wrong, and the individual appealed to may not need to fix it. But that's sort of the dynamic. That's how it works.
The other thing that stuck out to me in that NYU research I mentioned was the idea that Gen Z places a high value on authentic individuality. So authenticity still matters to this group, which I think is in tension with what's happening with ChatGPT and AI. You wrote a great piece a while back about flirting with AI music. I think the group was called
that was a fun
Velvet Sundown.
Right.
And you sounded very conflicted about whether you enjoyed AI music.
I was conflicted.
And I think that part of forming an authentic individual identity, certainly in my experience in the 90s, was about your record collection,
It was about your identity.
The authentic things that you put out there that you said I'm into. And, you know, how are we going to feel if we're into synthetic music?
I think one thing that has changed, I don't have any backing for this, so this is just me, you know, shooting from the hip, but I don't think authenticity was a personal value when we were younger. I think identity was. I think group belonging was. And music was one way of belonging to a group and forming identity. And, you know, you were a rocker or you were a punk or you were a goth. But that wasn't about being authentic. You're authentic. You wanted authenticity in the artists that you enjoyed. You didn't want them to be fake. You didn't want them to sell out.
That's what I mean.
Yeah,
the tryhards and fakes.
Right,
very
but
frowned upon.
the desire to be authentic to yourself, to be true to yourself, that was much more speculative, you know, especially for young people. I don't know, maybe I'm romanticizing. I feel like young people used to know more that they knew less about who they were. And now it's like...
Say that again.
Yeah, right? Like, I think that young people used to have less of a sense of confidence in their own identity and identity formation than young people appear to today. And there's like every incentive and encouragement for young people today to establish that identity as often and as fixed a way as possible and to perform
and doing it in a
online.
very public way.
Exactly.
Right, because there's now forums in which to create that identity, whether it's YouTube or...
Right. And so that means that you're just less experimental, you're less exploratory. If you put down part of that identity, instead of it just being like, yeah, that didn't serve me anymore, I'm not interested in that, or I don't even know why, it was just a caprice. Now it's like, oh, I'm not being true to my authentic self. That's who I really am, or that's where my followers are, whatever it might be. It's just like much more brittle to be the person that you are.
Do you think your students are consciously concerned about the degree to which they've lived their lives online, or is it everybody did, so everybody's horrible teens and 20s are going to be preserved forever on the internet?
I think the Gen Z era students are much more aware and concerned about it than the millennials that preceded them.
So we're going to have fewer Halloween photos that people have to apologize for? Is this your prediction?
I think that students today, and for the last 5 years or so, are much more suspicious and cynical about online life than the ones 10 years, 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think they see it instrumentally instead of in an identitarian way, by which I mean, okay, I got to have a LinkedIn, maybe I have to have some kind of social presence to interact with. I don't love this. I'm not doing this because I think I like it. Mm-hmm. And that is different than it was in the Twitter era.
I think the spirit of this whole conversation was to ask you if the kids are all right. And I wonder what you might just say to that question.
The kids are all right. The kids are always all right. It's hard to be young and not be all right. The question is whether there is a place to take that all rightness into. I think that's what they're struggling with now. But we have also kind of encouraged them not to be all right. And so I think they are struggling with the idea that society has for them, that they should be not okay, and that they should have mental anguish and anxiety, and that they, their performance is never enough. And all of these mythologies about them, these are much more public and much more frequent and constant than they used to be. And so imagine just if every day, everyone's always against the youth because they're young and they're
Sure.
different. And so it's not like that's new. Oh, the young people today, what are they doing? That's always been around. What is new is this kind of pathologization of it, the anxious generation, that there are these labels and these categories that the entirety of an age group are put in, rather than that, there are subcultures and, they have these predilections or these proclivities. But I think that broadly speaking, the kids they're all right in their own minds and bodies, but they've been subject to a set of forces that are increasingly difficult to deal with. And, you think about, gosh, you were reared through the internet, social media era, then COVID happened, and then you got dumped into AI in college. Oh, and by the way, the economy's terrible and you may not ever be able to get a job, and it costs $300,000 to go to school. That's just like Tinder waiting to burn up.
Well, Ian, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Oh gosh, yeah, no, thanks for having me.
College Matters from the Chronicle is a production of the Chronicle of Higher Education, the nation's leading independent newsroom covering colleges. If you like the show, please leave us a review or invite a friend to listen. And remember to follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast so that you never miss an episode. You can find an archive of every episode, all of our show notes, and much more at chronicle.com/College Matters. If you'd like, drop us a note at collegematters@chronicle.com. We are produced by Rococo Punch. Our Chronicle producer is Fernanda Zamudio Suarez. Our podcast artwork is by Cottrell Thomas. Special thanks to our colleagues Brock Reed, Joshua Hatch, Jillian Atelsik, Sarah Brown, Ron Coddington, Scott Seymour, Carmen Mendoza, and all of the people at the Chronicle who make this show possible. I'm Jack Stripling. Thanks for listening. We'd like to thank ZRG, The Registry, our sponsor for this episode. Learn how higher education institutions navigate change with proven interim leadership at zrgpartners.com/chronicle. Nobody covers international higher education like my colleague Karen Fisher. And now you get Karen's best reporting and most thoughtful analysis delivered directly to your inbox with her newsletter, Latitudes. Latitudes examines the economic, cultural, and political divides that shape and drive higher education's global relationships and reach. From study abroad programs to the effects of geopolitics on colleges, Karen covers it all. Sign up for free at chronicle.com/getnewsletters.